Almost nothing in social life exists in a vacuum. Virtually everything we experience socially is connected to, affected by, and has effects on many other aspects of the social world. We tend to talk about aspects of the social world as independent topics. We have to for the sake of clarity. Work, school, family. But there's very often overlap between various elements of social life. Examining how aspects of social life overlap and interconnect with each other is a key focus of sociology, and this is especially true when we examine how social class shapes people's lives. One cannot fully understand how social class and class inequalities affects people's lives without seeing its connections to other aspects of their lives. Just recall another one of our videos where we discuss the connections between social class differences and inequalities in education. One aspect of social life affects the other. The same is true for relationships between social class and race. They overlap and interconnect in patterned ways in ours and other societies around the world. Both race and social class interconnect with a wide array of other aspects of social life, but for this video we will focus on some of the connections to each other. And we will use this discussion to introduce the concept of institutional racism, also often referred to as systemic racism. This is different from what people typically mean when using the word racism. Racism often refers to actual beliefs and attitudes people have about others who fall in different racial categories. Beliefs that one category of people based on race is somehow inferior or superior in any way to other people of other racial categories is an explicit form of racial prejudice. With that form of racism, people believe it and act upon it. That kind of racism, the kind rooted in people's explicitly racist beliefs, their hearts and minds, so to speak, is distinct from institutional racism. When we talk about institutional racism, we're talking about dynamics through which a history of overt, explicit, and structural forms of racial oppression and discrimination continue to exert influence on aspects of social life today. They no longer exist in the ways that they used to, but their effects have not completely gone away. Importantly, institutional racism exists independently of people's current beliefs and attitudes. Even if we reject overt racist ideologies and racial prejudices, the effects of institutional racism still endure through the ways it shapes the social structures of our environment. Both forms of racism, overt racism and institutional racism, contribute to existing racial inequalities in social life. Some, though not all, of those racial inequalities include social class-based inequalities. Some data to highlight the overlap of race and social class, especially concerning poverty, and then we will discuss some ways we see institutional racism at work here. According to census data, roughly 13% of the total U.S. population was in poverty in 2023. But a closer look shows that this poverty rate is not experienced equally by all racial groups in the U.S. In the same year, only 8.8% of white non-Hispanic people in the U.S. lived in poverty, over 4 percentage points lower than the total percentage of the population. Compare that to blacks in the U.S., whose poverty rate was 18.5%, a full 5.5 percentage points higher than the total. The poverty rate for Hispanics of any race was 20.9%, nearly 8 percentage points higher than the overall poverty rate. In addition, American Indians live in poverty at a rate of 19%, and Asians experience a poverty rate of 13.6%. These data reflect what has been the case throughout U.S. history to varying degrees. People of color experience poverty at higher rates than others. Whites experience poverty at a lower rate than the national rate of poverty, and people of color experience poverty at a higher rate than the national rate of poverty. For Black, Hispanic, and American Indian populations, their poverty rate is substantially higher than the national rate and 10 or more percentage points higher than whites. That's a key form of social inequality. Some racial groups are more likely than others to experience poverty, and these patterns have persisted over time. There are many social factors that play into this. Institutional racism is one of them. A quick review of a definition of social class in the context of U.S. history regarding race relations offers a pretty clear illustration of how institutional racism works. A basic definition of the term social class is that it refers to groups of people similar on 4 characteristics: their educational attainment, their occupational status or prestige, their income, and their wealth. Obviously, people combine wildly diverse combinations of these characteristics, but there are also clear patterns as well. The higher educational degree one attains, the higher the occupational status available to them, which also comes with higher income, and this combination positions them to build wealth over time in a number of ways. Conversely, lower levels of education limit employment opportunities and related income, which constrains people's ability to accumulate wealth. Obviously, there are many exceptions and caveats in people's particular everyday lives, but these broad patterns of the relationships between education, employment, and income and wealth have been fairly stable with time. We've all been told some version of this throughout our childhoods. Work hard in school, go to college, get a degree, maybe 2 or 3 degrees. Start a career, increase your earning power, save and invest your money, etc. Well, let's go through that list of social class characteristics with attention to the history of U.S. race relations and how they have been structured. For this discussion, we'll focus on Black Americans, though one could do a similar historical analysis of other racial groups and their experience in the U.S. over time. Any history of Black Americans in the U.S. must begin with the institution of slavery. There's no avoiding it. For hundreds of years and generations of Black and brown people, enslavement was the experience forcefully imposed upon them by mandate of law in the U.S. What did this mean for their ability to obtain education? It all but completely eliminated it. Slavery precluded access to education for enslaved peoples. It was illegal in many contexts for enslaved people to learn or teach literacy, for example, let alone have any chance at obtaining higher levels of education. Likewise, by definition, if one is enslaved, they possess no status relative to their occupation because they do not have an occupation. Their work is enslaved work. Their status is that of property to slave owners. They therefore, by definition, receive no compensation for their work. They do not derive income from their work in the way that we think of income in the current labor market. Again, this was forbidden by law. Finally, by definition, if one is the property of others, then they themselves possess no property or wealth of their own, nor do they exercise any property rights. They are other people's property according to law. Related, slavery mandated cruel constraints on family structure. Enslaved persons exercised few rights over their ability to maintain their family relationships. Family is a key means through which people accumulate and transfer wealth across generations, and this means of wealth transfer was all but cut off by slavery as an institution. So, the institution of slavery denied or severely constrained access to essentially all elements of social class status for enslaved persons for generations. They had no meaningful access to education, occupational status, income, or wealth for hundreds of years by mandate of law. Slavery itself legally ended in 1863 and then more forcefully at the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865. But subsequent institutional arrangements continued to severely limit Black Americans' access to social class resources for decades. Reconstruction in the Jim Crow era, during which blacks were systematically denied equal access to education, employment, housing, as well as being subjected to ongoing acts and threats of violence, endured for decades. Major structural changes ensued in the mid-20th century in the Brown decisions of 1954 and 1955, as well as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. To be sure, these changes set in motion major advancements in opportunities for people of color, as well as women, in access to social class resources, especially in education and employment. And not surprisingly, in the historical period since the 1960s, we have seen increased access to education and employment with the growth in the Black middle class, as well as dramatic increases in women's success in education and the labor market. The impact of these structural changes really can't be overstated. However, it's been 60 years since the Civil Rights Act. Legally enforced forms of slavery, apartheid, and overt racial discrimination stretch back at least 300 years prior to the 1960s. The effects of 300 years of racist systems, especially on the generational transmission of social class resources, cannot be completely undone in 60 years. We still struggle with ongoing and multiple forms of racism, including institutional racism and implicit racial biases in people's everyday interactions, along with continued racist ideologies explicitly shared among current segments of the population. Segregation in both housing and education remains a persistent pattern in American life, even though Jim Crow laws enforcing it no longer exist. Likewise, disproportionate representation among people of color in both poverty rates and incarceration rates continues to persist. Inequalities rooted in deep histories of social institutions that precluded access to social class resources for people of color and subjected them to carceral control. All of these dynamics of racial inequality, their overlap with social class inequality, and their links to our history have been thoroughly and expansively documented with empirical social science. On institutionalized forms of persistent inequalities in education and their roots in history, see Eve Ewing's book on school closures in Chicago, as well as Amanda Lewis and John Diamond's book on persistent forms of racial inequality in high-performing schools. On institutionalized forms of persistent inequalities throughout the labor market, see Bill Wilson's book on historical and structural shifts on the availability of work for people of color, as well as Diva Pager's book on persistent forms of racial discrimination in hiring practices. On institutionalized forms of persistent inequalities in racial segregation, housing, and social class opportunities, see another book by Wilson on the truly disadvantaged, as well as Massey and Denton's book on housing segregation in the U.S. On institutionalized forms of persistent inequalities in our criminal justice system, see Brian Stevenson's book on racial discrimination in the administration of capital punishment, as well as Michelle Alexander's book on mass incarceration. All of these works of empirical science trace the role of history in shaping contemporary forms of racial inequality. Institutional racism is not conjecture or abstract theorizing. It is a rigorously documented empirical reality. And a key step in addressing and alleviating inequalities is recognizing and acknowledging the role of history and how it shapes our current social structures.